I'll be brief. It's my absolute pleasure tonight on behalf of the Awards Committee, on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society tonight, to award the 2025 J.P. Thompson Medal to Emeritus Professor Richie Howard. Thanks very much.
Should I be clever and try and put my timer on or not? I think I've timed this so it will work. So let's hope. Warami Welamambami, Warami Mitiga, Digigarangaraba. Greetings to you wherever you're from. Hello, friends. Thanks for listening. With Darug approval, I greet you in Darug Dalang, the language of the Darug First Nation of the Sydney region. I humbly acknowledge the country, the law, ancestors of First Peoples on whose country I was born and have lived and worked on the Wallamadigal clan of the Darug Nation of the Southern Continent. I appreciate the generous welcome that I've been offered by the Darug Nation, and I pay respect to their elders, past, present and future, and the wisdom that's been passed down through their generations. I acknowledge the ancestors, the lands, the waters, the skies of the Durable and Yagara peoples who have never ceded any of their territory to any colonizer. I pay my respects to their elders and the families, past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge that tonight we celebrate the life of Koki Mabo and the judicial recognition of native title in 1992. So it's quite an auspicious day to be delivering this talk. And I thank the Royal Geographical Society of Queensland for the opportunity to present my thoughts in this Thompson oration and the honour of being presented the Thompson Medal. Now, I've spent 45 years working with First Nations peoples across Australia. I've spent over 15 years working on considering parallel issues in Taiwan. And I remain perplexed by the question that I raise in the title. Why is it so difficult for Indigenous peoples to exercise the self-determination that's articulated as a basic right that sits within globally affirmed human rights standards and various policy commitments and even legislative instruments in our two nations? My current reflections on this question are rooted in my engagement with Indigenous, that is, still colonizing domains, both in Taiwan and Australia. I acknowledge the lands, waters, skies and ancestors of the territories of First Peoples in both Australia and Taiwan. In neither of these places have First Peoples territories ever been ceded to any of the diverse colonising outsiders that have occupied them. And yet First Peoples' opportunities to exercise their collective rights to self-determination remain extremely limited and deeply opposed both politically and societally at national and subnational scales. Now, the link between Taiwan and Australia might be a bit unfamiliar to some. So let me say there are some surprising similarities. We have comparable population sizes with similar proportions of First Nations and settler populations. In both jurisdictions, Indigenous peoples have never ceded their traditional territories to any coloniser. Both are complex settler colonial societies whose identity is contested internally and externally. We're both haunted by distinctive, complex and unresolved traumas. Both sit rather awkwardly in the geopolitical settings that have been generated by environmental, economic and political uncertainties. We're both complexly entangled in the contested relations between the so-called great powers of China and the United States. Australia and Taiwan both see ourselves as small, rather marginal players in the geopolitical machinations that are affecting us. We both suffer from a cultural cringe that craves external approval, political, market, academic, before ideas, inventions, performers, creatives can be really valued at home. And in both our societies, despite some rhetorical commitment to self-determination for First Nations, there has been limited progress towards delivering the rights that are anticipated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So in exploring this question of why self-determination is so hard for Indigenous peoples to achieve, I acknowledge and offer my respect, my support and my service to the wisdom of those First Peoples, to their elders, past, present and future, and to their lands, waters and skies. So, despite some movement towards acknowledging the rights of First Peoples in both Australia and Taiwan, the de facto societal setting remains overwhelmingly colonial in both places. As elsewhere in settler colonial societies around the world, I think it's fair to characterise the societal, sorry, I think I was supposed to put this slide up, but just a tad earlier. It's just that the writing on when to change slides is really little. And I didn't want to look over my glasses at you. There it is. So let me brush back. So despite that movement, I think it's fair to characterise the societal trajectory in relation to Indigenous rights in both places as a determination to continue business as usual, a determination to continue colonising the everyday spaces of First Peoples' lives. In increasingly uncertain geopolitical, economic and environmental times, there are deeply entrenched expectations that we, the dominant settler colonising populations, can just keep doing things as we've always done them. Whether it's called business as usual, the status quo, the same as it ever was, or another day in the colony, the effect of this society is this societal insistence that colonial, neo-colonial, still colonising, and even ostensibly post-colonial state institutions will persist in determining what is best for the First Peoples in their jurisdictions. That is, states will decide what rights Indigenous groups can exercise, how those rights will be administered, and what, if any, legal obligations might constrain the settler colonial state and its beneficiaries in restricting and ignoring the internationally recognised rights of Indigenous peoples. The still colonising state, supported by the still colonising settler societies, whatever legal, political or moral arguments are presented, will determine the barriers and the pathways to self-determination for First Nations. Despite rhetorical commitment of states to various conventions and declarations about rights to self-determination, First Peoples are locked into legal, institutional and political structures that protect the state from fundamental challenge or change. I find this deeply troubling. It underpins continuation, amplification and renewal of the traumas of colonial encounter. It disfigures and rots our democratic societies and denies fundamental rights to First Peoples. In my work as a teacher, as a researcher, as a public intellectual, an activist and an ally, I have long rejected this business as usual approach, and my conclusion is this: rhetorical and limited state recognition of rights for Indigenous peoples within the status quo of business as usual settings reinforces rather than challenges and changes colonial and still colonising societal attitudes and actions. So business as usual must be rejected as a foundation for future success in our societies. Business as usual lays the foundations for futures that constantly threaten truth, justice, environmental quality, and culture for everyone. The business as usual approach imagines our national histories offer an unproblematic narrative of moving forwards, or perhaps even upwards, to realise national destiny. In international legal frameworks, ideas such as the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, the legitimacy of military conquest remain influential, and nation states having suppressed and violated First Nations populations and their customary institutions of governance, property and law, LAW, assume that they know what is best for First Peoples within their national territories and how they can move them out of the way of progress. Colonisation, of course, must not be seen as an event, a single moment of invasion, occupation or dispossession in the past. Colonisation is an insistent and continuing process. It's not a metaphor for injustice. It's a very real set of ongoing relationships and practices that deny First Peoples their humanity and their internationally recognised right to self-determination. Business as usual is embedded in national institutions, in societal practices, attitudes and values. So this business as usual approach is colonising in perpetuity, a pernicious, immoral and unjustifiable mode of governing human and environmental relationships. It needs to be rejected as an acceptable mode of modern governance. Business as usual continues the work of colonisation. The status quo works to renew the primitive accumulation that was set in train by each wave of occupation, dispossession and violence. Business as usual amplifies and repeats the trauma that First Peoples experienced and continue to experience at every stage of colonial encounter. It reminds us that intergenerational trauma in First Nations communities is not solely a product of the past. It is renewed and recreated in every meeting, every project, every policy that insists on denying, disrespecting and destroying First Peoples' places, identities and autonomy as a condition of progress. Business as usual is, as Chelsea Wattego has so powerfully put it, just another day in the colony. In every colony and for First Peoples in just about every colonial encounter. But in neither Australia nor Taiwan can a singular Indigenous voice set out an agreed agenda for change. In both jurisdictions, national institutions and leaders anticipate reconciliation of a still colonising past can only occur when an imagined singular Indigenous other expresses a singular, clear, coherent statement of what they want. If only they could agree, the thinking goes, what they want from us, we could give it to them and move on. It's as if the settler society remains free not to act at all until First Peoples stop being trauma affected, diverse and uncertain about their preferred futures. The misconceptions underpinning that thinking sometimes leaves me speechless, but I'll try to talk anyways. And of course, the truth is both more complicated and much simpler than that. First, self-determination is a right that belongs to First Nations. It is not a gift to be given by the colonisers. And second, of course, there is no simple one-size-fits-all answer to the challenges of untangling the consequences of colonial trauma. No one-step solutions to the policy challenges, no approaches that will receive universal approval. So we should stop expecting it. Ed Soja's metaphor of a cacophonous silence that he referred to Los Angeles as represents well the spaces that I work in. There is a lot of noise and not enough listening going on. There is impatience to move forward quickly towards the goals that governments set, but long-standing settler unwillingness to actually listen to what First Nations peoples themselves say is already working or what needs to be addressed. Both Australia and Taiwan are champions of democracy, and yet we're both haunted by historical traumas that are hard to acknowledge and harder to overcome. Both face contemporary divisions and challenges that divert even well-intentioned rhetoric away from transformative engagement with First Peoples societies, geographies, histories, and experiences, and their claims to collective justice in the 21st century societies in which they're now entangled. Both Australia and Taiwan see ourselves as championing human rights and democracy. Both demonstrate the difficulty of delivering on that rhetoric in practice. It's difficult to reweave relationalities that are woven from generations of colonial trauma into a social fabric of justice, recognition, inclusion, and welcome. In Taiwan, an open democracy has emerged from the shadow of trauma, but geopolitical actors who claim various rights to or interests in the archipelago threaten that democracy. Taiwan has a unique place in the global community. Its post-martial law journey, balancing its tenuous status quo within the ambiguous national and international status, while connecting its troubled authoritarian pasts to a democratic and rights-based future, is, I think, quite inspirational. But the cultural, administrative, and economic histories of Taiwan's continuing colonisation challenge processes of decolonising and Indigenous self-determination. Taiwan's ambiguous place in the community of nations and its long history of both First Peoples autonomy and multiple colonial occupations means there's a very real sense in Taiwan that everyone feels colonised. In Australia, our complexly divided society totters between early settler arrogance, new settler uncertainty, environmental catastrophe, and naive and greedy opportunism. I should have put something more optimistic in that list as well. Ironically characterised as the lucky country in Donald Horne's 1964 book of that name, Australia assumes that its special place in the world originates in the British Crown's claim to possess the island continent and excuses many of its failings. We're blessed with extraordinary cultural diversity, but it seems we're societally incapable of understanding the value of the deep histories of connection and belonging in cultural landscapes that are so profoundly disrupted by colonisation. Societally, Australia has failed to move past knee-jerk dismissal of the possibility of decolonising and self-determination. Its international advocacy of some human rights is assumed to excuse the reprehensible record on the treatment of children, refugees, asylum seekers, and women, as well as First Peoples, which reveals a very uneven delivery of human rights and democracy in practice. It is as if in Australia, no one is supposed to feel colonised. So let me give you a very short genealogy of self-determination. Now, I say very short because as I wrote the first draft of this paper and got to 14,000 words and recognised that wouldn't fit into 40 minutes, I thought, well, maybe there's a book in this. So this is a very short account. After World War II, colonialism was increasingly discredited as a legitimate form of international state structure. The concept of self-determination emerged as a principle of international law, and a period of decolonisation was expected to mark the end of empires. The self-determination emerged as a powerful, even preeminent human right. But it was more a conceptual ideal than a justiciable right. United Nations Resolution 1514, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, was passed in the General Assembly in December 1960s. But for many First Nations in the former colonies, colonising continued. The administrative boundaries of the old colonial order became the recognised boundary of the newly decolonised nation states. Indigenous territories that had been denied, ignored and obliterated during the geographical expansion of various empires were again denied, ignored and obliterated. The diverse customary governances of diverse First Peoples across the world, whose authority and legitimacy predated and continued despite the colonising expansion of various empires being reorganised, were treated as invisible and inconsequential. Indeed, the scale of Indigenous governance that constituted Indigenous territories and the relationships between Indigenous jurisdictions and authorities continued to be targeted for erasure and elimination by state structures in the new and ostensibly decolonising world order. The post-colonial states continued treating First Peoples as if they were not capable of exercising self-determination. So passage of UN Resolutions 1514 did not protect the peoples of the Fourth World. Decolonisation and the creation of the post-colonial states did little to erase racism, pauperisation and marginalisation of First Peoples in the newly created so-called post-colonial nation states that were not in practice post-colonial at all. For Indigenous groups in Taiwan, decolonisation was illusory at best. Defeat of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific War delivered their traditional territories to China, which had never exercised jurisdiction over the whole archipelago. In other words, under international, mainly American oversight, the archipelago's multiple indigenous territories were transferred from one imperial power, Japan, to another, China, just as the Qing dynasty had purported to do in 1895 with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, when the Taiwanese, like the Koreans, were non-participating victims in imperial treaty making. As Chu puts it, no meaningful decolonisation of any sort at any level took place. Instead, there was a classic case of recolonisation, which resulted in reproducing similar absolute sovereignizing power structures. The nationalist Kuomintang regime postured to distance itself from the Japanese, while in reality, the colonial ruling apparatus was kept carefully intact. And in Australia, of course, there was no pretense of decolonisation because the continent had been illegally declared terra nullius, and the colonisers claimed vacant possession with no need to consider the original owners until the native title cases of the 1990s. Efforts to resist ongoing colonisation, to reclaim autonomy, to exercise self-determination have consistently met with state and societal opposition, constrained by a conceptual realpolitik that sees the geographical structures of colonialisms as the only imaginable geographies. Thus, it's important to recognise that the empires were reconfigured rather than decolonised. And in those reconfigurations, First Peoples remained at the margins, more talked about than listened to. So let me address my question specifically. I want to point to 5 key reasons that I think self-determination is hard to exercise. First, states refuse to recognise the scale of Indigenous governance. And people think I'm a bit of a scale maniac. I am a bit obsessed with geographical scale because I think it is such a powerful concept. But the scale of governance of Indigenous jurisdictions was what was specifically targeted by colonialism. I'll come back very briefly to talk about it. Education continues to operate in a still colonizing mode in most of our structures. Bureaucracy entangles First Nations in a Kafkaesque madness. Heritage legislation refuses to acknowledge First Nation heritage as living culture. And finally, the institutional incapacities plague the statist frameworks that dominate Indigenous affairs. So, scales of governance. First Nations institution and the nature of their governance in Australia survived and adapted for 60,000 years or more. And yet they receive no accolades, no celebration, no recognition that they were successful and durable forms of governance. We celebrate that we have governments that last for 3 years sometimes. And yet we fail to recognise that these systems of law and governance were intact and in place for 60,000 years or more. Instead, throughout my lifetime, First Nations have been subjected to institutionalised surveillance, misrepresentation, violence, incarceration and racism. The early erasure of the scale of governance and imposition of colonial administration and military authority in the Australian colonies continues to echo in Australian government's approaches to First Peoples. Even, and that's worth a book in its own right, I think, just that sentence, even the advocacy of human rights and the rights of people have become enmeshed in what Richard Falk refers to as the statist framework of rights that challenges First Peoples' rights to self-determination. By rendering self-determination in terms of nationalism, separatism and decolonisation, the imaginary of a singular, maybe I was supposed to change, yes I was, because there's a map here that explodes the notion of the imaginary of a singular sovereign that characterised the age of empires, was reimposed as essential, natural and unavoidable across territories where the post-colonial imaginary saw decolonisation and First Peoples experienced something else entirely. And of course, that singular national sovereign entity was never quite what had been imagined. In Australia, for example, the creation of the Australian nation state, the sovereign state that we all are citizens of in 1901, retained a fractured sovereignty shared between the new federal government. Should I admit someone? Will you do it? Oh, good on you. The new federal government and the participating colonial governments. And to this day, Australia retains the British Crown as the source of its national sovereignty. While conservative and racist ideologues call any movement towards treaty, voice or truth-telling to address the colonial legacies for First Peoples a threat to national sovereignty. The imaginary that Australia is a single country is shattered by the realisation that its constitution is not only a federation of persistent colonial governments with rather dubious legal foundations, but it's also a continent of hundreds of First Peoples countries over which foundational sovereignty was never ceded. And in Taiwan, competing notions of Taiwan, China and identity construct vastly different versions and scales of the Taiwan nation. So the omnipresent and pernicious scale of nation, the national scale, becomes a significant barrier to self-determination for many First Peoples. And while the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples offers a baseline of the collective rights First Peoples are entitled to exercise in whatever governance systems they find themselves embedded, their uncertain status within our two nations of Australia and Taiwan demonstrates the difficulties. Racialised and politicised opposition to recognition of First Peoples creates division, and despite the plethora of models for recognition of self-determination at multiple scales, rejection of truth-telling, treaty-making and recognition continue to limit the progress in both jurisdictions, and the continued refusal to accept and support the scales, protocols and practices of Indigenous governance ensures that any offers of alternatives to self-determination from the states are at best inadequate. And now I turn to education. Coming from a passionate teacher, my statement that education is a second significant barrier to First Nation self-determination may seem paradoxical, but bear with me while I explain briefly. Education has long been a powerful tool in the colonisers' hands. Despite having well-developed systems of knowledge development and knowledge transfer, colonial administrative systems treated Indigenous governance systems as simply incapable of dealing with education, assuming that colonial administrators' racist visions for the future generations were somehow superior to the long-standing traditions and systems. Children were taken into various systems and institutions that were focused not on education, but on administrative priorities. In Darugnoora, for example, colonial education for Aboriginal people was framed as Christianising and civilising the savages. As in so many settings, education was intended to separate children from their languages, from their families, from their countries and their cultures. Even in its more enlightened form, Australia's colonial education systems treated First Nations children as having limited potential, and it was intended to prepare young women for domestic service and young men for labour. As Bob Morgan has put it, Australian colonial education for Aboriginal people was best described as an exercise in social engineering and a not-so-veiled form of cultural genocide. Marnie Shea and her colleagues in 2023 described Australia's overwhelming failure to deliver effective policy reform in Indigenous education, and in that they see a willful determination in Australian policymakers' ignorance of both evidence and culturally informed advice in developing and implementing major policies affecting First Nation peoples. Reluctantly, I turn to bureaucracy because it entangles us all. We're all plagued by increasingly demanding bureaucracy, but First Peoples are often enmeshed in complex bureaucratic webs that affect every aspect of their lives. Definitions of indigeneity, for example, are controlled by statist bureaucracies that not only determine who is Indigenous, but what services, opportunities and entitlements they might have access to. The bureaucratic forest that First Peoples are entangled in is anathema to the idea and principles of self-determination. The statist framework authorises itself to define who Indigenous people are, why they are, what they can do in relation to their lands and waters. That is, the still colonising state claims to itself the power of determination over First Peoples, and in the process creates bureaucratic mazes that impose ongoing and very contemporary trauma on First Nations citizens. As Auntie Pat Turner, convener of the Coalition of Peak Community-Controlled Organisations, observed, too often we see delay, half measures and a failure to empower our communities with real decision-making power. If we're to achieve lasting change, the solutions must be led by us, not imposed upon us. If we fail to work in an interconnected way, policies risk sounding good in theory, but failing in practice. Collaboration and genuine commitment to real partnerships aren't just ideals, they are essential to closing the gap. And I understand there might be some contemporary and currency in my next slide about heritage in Brisbane. Australia hosts the longest surviving continuous cultural and governance systems on the planet. But First Nations culture was long treated as a relic to be protected by the state under legislation that equated it with fauna and flora. Expansion of tourism in the late 20th century saw Aboriginal heritage emerge as a significant tourism marketing tool. But First Peoples' living cultures and long-lived traditions do not belong to settlers and their states or their tourism marketing machines. Protection of heritage as living culture has become an important element of First Peoples' struggle to secure their collective right to self-determination. Yet bureaucratisation of heritage has become yet another domain in which First Nations face barriers, complexity and hostility. Even when heritage status seems to offer a level of recognition and resourcing to First Peoples, and in the case of World Heritage listings, can even offer some semblance of international standing to hold statist frameworks accountable, the extent to which First Nations custodians are respected as decision makers exercising self-determination is limited. State agencies insist on co-management rather than First Nation governance of heritage. And heritage experts often have limited or poor understanding of trauma. Even where co-management is secured, statist and expert-centred frameworks treat First Peoples authorities as junior partners rather than co-equal decision makers. Indigenous scholars remind us over and over again that colonisation is an ongoing lived experience, not a singular historic event. Decolonisation is not a metaphor able to ease the settler unease at the histories of colonisation that were and continue to be written in letters of fire and blood. Even well-intentioned academic allies are at risk of sympathetically parading First Peoples' trauma as their case studies, as something to be prodded and analysed rather than healed. And so I come to the nub of my answer of where the problem is. In much of my work, I've been troubled by a common assumption, principally in the still colonizing institutions and societal mindsets, that what is needed is capacity building in Indigenous populations. In fact, capacity building was a policy for a long time that I railed against. And then I came up with the term institutional incapacity, because this approach of capacity building blames the victims and excuses the perpetrators. Justice would be much better served by addressing the institutional and societal capacity deficits for engaging with First Peoples of our still colonising societies. We live in the midst of what I've come to understand as ontological pluralism, and it's the institutional and interpersonal capacity deficits for engaging with First Peoples within statist and racist structures, legislation, and the still colonising practices that limit progress towards self-determination. Business as usual persists, and it is the key barrier to achieving justice through self-determination. So in preparing this talk, I've faced what I think is an issue that might be considered deeply personal. Do I have a right to speak out on such matters? I'm a non-Indigenous scholar, an outsider in Taiwan, and a descendant of the colonising settler population in Australia. I was born and nurtured in and by Darugnoura. I've lived and worked in, with and for many Aboriginal countries across the southern continent, alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and mentors on key issues encompassing the contemporary impacts of industrial projects and questions of environmental and social justice. I've participated in major negotiations between Aboriginal groups and mining companies, governments and projects. I've been a teacher in schools, universities and community settings, and I've worked for my sins in the education bureaucracy in Australia. My personal experience shapes my view on these issues that I've addressed here, but it's not the foundation of my argument that Indigenous peoples' collective right to self-determination is central to the future of all of us. My positionality as a child of Australian colonisation does not give me a right to speak on behalf of my diverse First Nations colleagues. Their stories, their truth are theirs to tell, not mine. I've been privileged with access to education and opportunities to learn, to build an understanding about the nature of our societies, the consequences of our shared and distinctive histories and geographies. And my observation is that my privileged position gives me not a right, but an absolute obligation to speak out on these issues. Modern democracies have been built on histories of colonisation, violence, racism and injustice. Our societies will always be vulnerable to division along racial and other societal fault lines, while the histories and geographies that denied and continue to create barriers to First Peoples autonomy are denied, hidden and distorted. Recognising and celebrating the extraordinary human achievements of societies that predated colonial possession of our nations and acknowledging the diverse wisdoms of systems of governance, autonomy and survival that were built in the geographies that we now share is neither idealistic nor naive. It is essential to building our shared capacity to support justice, sustainability and survival in a world of constant change and challenge. So my conclusion is that business as usual must be rejected. As Albert Memmi put it, I don't know how long ago that is, but it seems a long time ago. If colonisation destroys the colonised, it also rots the coloniser. It's not surprising that settler colonial societies and the status frameworks they create have difficult relationships with the peoples they colonise. Current business as usual approaches fail to deliver even the minimal rights that are represented in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Such approaches are not confined to some imagined colonial past. They persist in the present and they remain trapped by the often denied realities of the colonial pasts of our nations. Such business as usual must be rejected. My presentation has outlined specific barriers facing First Peoples' struggles to secure their right to collective self-determination. While my list is far from exhaustive, I hope I've been able to point to some of the changes that we can pursue towards justice, sustainability and inclusion. In answer to my opening question, it is the attitudes, practices and values of our nation's still colonizing societies, our incapacities, arrogance and ignorance, along with our insistence on business as usual, that is the basic problem. But it is in our power to change these things. I've been generously welcomed and mentored by people of many First Nations throughout my life. My education was nurtured in classrooms by fabulous teachers and on country with many wise teachers whose qualifications reflect more than 60,000 years of learning that was not erased by a couple of centuries of European civilising arrogance. Thank you to the Royal Geographical Society of Queensland for the honour of speaking of my experience that leads me to acknowledge the urgent need to recognise and respect the wisdom and authority of First Nations that reflects their long histories of working to belong together in countries. My experience leads me to conclude that our societies have much to learn as well as much to offer if we allow ourselves to recognise and respect that wisdom and allow it to exercise authority to realise that the right to self-determination threatens only those who imagine they should continue to colonise and rule in such dangerously outmoded and unjustifiable ways. Tijrigorangaraba ngaya yanu.
Thank you, Richie. That was an incredibly insightful presentation. I think all of those here online and in person would very much like to give you thanks for that presentation.
And it was good.
You were bang on schedule. The team will be happy. That does leave us with a bit of time for questions. So for those here in person, if you do have a question, please raise your hand. And for those online, please do put your questions into the chat. And we have Richie here to
Indeed, you do.
attempt to potentially to try to answer them. Do we have any opening questions from the floor? John.
Did you think that the voice to Parliament was just another act of colonial arrogance, and that the push for the truth telling is really a better way to go anyway, and that maybe the no vote winning might end up being the better way in the end anyway?
It's an ambiguous. I can't give you a direct answer to that because I don't think it's my place to speak on what was right or wrong. What I can say is that I think that as a nation, we weren't ready to be asked that question, and that it played into some of the most dangerous and divisive racism in Australia. But I think what I recognised was amongst those who supported a yes vote, there was a complete incomprehension of why some Aboriginal nations would be saying it's the wrong question, because who would have been empowered by the voice was largely the Aboriginal institutions that have been given authority by the states. So because I work with Darug people in Sydney, and Darug people have been overwhelmed by state authorised institutional structures that refuse to adequately recognise the standing of Darug people as custodians. And the land councils in Sydney have become the biggest property developers and the richest Aboriginal organisations in Australia. And if any non-Aboriginal organisation did to custodians what the land councils do to custodians in Sydney, we would think Rio Tinto were angels. Yeah, so I think we've got a comprehension problem, and that I won't go into the politics of voice treaty and truth telling, but what's left out of that is healing, and that truth telling is fundamental to healing, and that my Aboriginal mentors emphasise healing as the first step, and that it's not just, and as I put the Albert Memmi quote up very deliberately, because for those of you who are educators, Paulo Freire says exactly the same thing. Yeah, that colonization dehumanizes the colonizer as well as the colonized, and that if we don't understand what this history has done to the dominant society and what it imposes on new settler societies in terms of learning to belong together in country, that incomprehension amplifies the trauma. And I see that in every meeting that I have with my Durham colleagues with government agencies in Sydney over and over again, which is why I didn't want to. Who wanted to talk about the Powerhouse early today? The Powerhouse Museum. Yeah, the Powerhouse Museum was a nightmare for Durham custodians. Yeah. So, well, does that satisfy? Give you a beginning of a possible answer? There was a question.
A completely different type of question, this time on Taiwan. Who were the First Nations people there and who were the colonizers?
Yes, okay.
Before the Qing.
Before the Qing, so I'll just go into a very brief history of Taiwan. So there were the first people in Taiwan asked me, what's the difference between Australia and Taiwan? I say about 60,000 years. Yeah. So that the Indigenous groups in Taiwan seem to have arrived as the foundation of Austronesian peoples somewhere between 10 and 6,000 years ago. And the Austronesian peoples then spread out across Oceania through Indonesia as far as Madagascar, the largest geographical distribution of a language group on the planet. And there's some settlement on the Western Plain from time to time by people coming from Fujian in mainland China, but nobody exercised any colonial authority over the entirety of Formosa, the island of Formosa, or across the archipelago of islands that are now part of Taiwan, until the Japanese acquired colonial sovereignty from the Qing dynasty, who lost the battle with Japan and signed a treaty where they ceded Taiwan, which they didn't own, to the Japanese. There had been Portuguese, Spanish, and I've probably left out a couple of people as well who had little enclaves in parts of Taiwan but never exercised governance. There was an independent Republic of Taiwan briefly, which had a national flag that lasted for 6 weeks in the interregnum between the absence of the Qing dynasty and the presence of the Japanese colonial authority. So Japan ruled for 50 years. I find it fascinating to think in 50-year periods, because 50 years is a life, it's a living memory lifetime. And I've done work, I've spent periods doing field work in the period from 1820 to 1870 in Sydney. I've worked with Jan Monk, who happened to do her field work in rural New South Wales and never threw out any of her data in 1965. And so we did a 50-year period trying to understand the statistical policy and community narratives of that period of change, which encompassed the major changes of Aboriginal policy in Australia. So 50 years of colonial occupation by Japan imposed insistence on Japanese language. It finally created the island of Formosa as a singularity. So Taiwan only came into existence under the Japanese. The Americans then gave Japanese sovereignty to China. China was in the midst of a civil war after the Second World War, and the sovereignty that was handed over was always disputed. There was another interregnum where there was an arguable existing sovereignty of Taiwan in a small republic that did, I think, lasted 6 days that time. But so it's a really contested history. And the Chinese, the PRC narrative that it is the 29th province is bullshit, if I can call it for what it is. It has never been Chinese. And my Indigenous colleagues in Taiwan say, yeah, it doesn't matter who thinks they own it, it's still our territory. And I think that that's actually a really salutary lesson to hear. And there's a reference to a paper that came up that I wrote with a colleague about the scale of Taiwan, where we try to turn Taiwan inside out. And so what does Taiwan look like if you start from these Indigenous territories and build up to Taiwan? It looks very different than if you think of it as a geopolitical prize held between two great powers. I don't think that answers your question, but it will start a very long conversation, I'm sure.
It's a short question. What would self-determination for Indigenous people in Australia look like? We've heard on a high level, but just on a practical ground level, what would we see that was different? How would it work?
You would see, so let's take the welcome to country, yeah, as a contestable entry point. What does it mean to be welcome to country? It doesn't mean what white fellas, I don't want to use that binary, what the colonizers have imagined it to mean. You're welcome to my country, come and take it. Yeah. As a respectful guest, you listen. So the first thing that would happen is that we would be asked to listen and to respond, and not to tell people what they're allowed to do and what they're allowed to think. And I think that understanding that because that question has never been asked, we don't know what the answer would be. And so to make progress conditional on knowing what the answer will be is to silence Indigenous voices yet again. So it will mean different things in different places. It will, and the notions, if I take the question of treaty as an example, when the native title cases were decided, my line to people was, well, the first treaties will be treaties between Indigenous people, who will then decide how to treat with the colonial governments. And that we haven't even yet begun to create the space where that first conversation can be had. So we can't answer your question. I know it's a short question, but, and I'm reputed to give long answers to short questions, but the reason that we can't answer that question is because we actually haven't even begun to create the space where the possibilities can be imagined by Indigenous governances, because we don't believe there are Indigenous governances remaining in Australia. We have silenced and erased those authorities and jurisdictions. So we have to undo quite a bit, and we have to shut up and let those conversations happen, and then listen to what has been decided.
Beyond Australia and Taiwan, are there any examples globally where a process of self-determination has started?
Yes, there is, successful? and successful. I'm
adding to that.
It's really interesting working in First Nations politics, because everywhere you go, everybody thinks somewhere else is doing it better. And, you know, we all look to Aotearoa and think, that'd be great. And then you get a change of government where people want to do stupid things and don't understand the value that's being created by the nature of what's been negotiated around the Treaty of Waitangi. You go to Canada and people will think, oh, there's really good treaty negotiations that have taken out dams in salmon rivers and created new governance structures. And all that's true, but it's all problematic because the dominant theme of state-supported, I hesitate to use the word development, but let's use it as a problematic term, of state-supported development is business as usual. That it's to say, well, your participation in governance is conditional on complying to the dominant law, and we will wipe out the traditions and customary protocols and law. The thing that drives me crazy about academics at the moment, sorry for any academics who are here, is when people talk about Indigenous law/law, as if LAW/LORE, as if Indigenous law isn't quite the same as statutory law or common law. Whereas common law is just the whitefella version, the English version of Aboriginal law, LAW. And yet we refuse to accept that there are Aboriginal jurisdictions in which that law is the law. And yet that's what the native title decisions recognise, that the state, the colonising state in the 18th and 19th century was not only capable of recognising property and law, but was obliged to under international legal principles. And we have never come to terms with that in Australia. And I don't think they've ever come to, despite the treaties in North America, I don't think they've ever come to terms with it in North America either.
You think a big stumbling block here is that the Western tradition and stuff is ensconced in written. Everything's written, and Aborigines don't have
Writing.
Recorded history in that sense.
Oh, but so they do. See, it's just that we don't recognise it.
For a colonizer, it's a sort of, well, it doesn't exist.
So one of the reasons that I get excited about Taiwan, and the reason I've been going back to Taiwan for 15 years and that I've accepted a 3-year position in Taiwan, is because Taiwan taught me to stop talking about colonialism as a Eurocentric Western phenomenon. Yeah, I used to teach about Siberia in order to try and get my students to stop thinking that colonisation was an Australian, North American, the Kansas, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, USA phenomenon, and to think a bit more deeply. Yeah, we only need to look at Lachlan Macquarie, of his colonial history, that he was active in India before he became the governor of New South Wales and trashed Darugnoora and trashed Tasmania. So we need to understand that colonialism is a form of governance that imposes without listening. And that imposing without listening, it imposes a human and environmental cost, which is proving to be unbearable. And it's proving to be unbearable for all of us. So I could give this same talk focused on the environmental consequences of colonialism. I think the human consequences need to be prioritised. But the environmental consequences of colonialism, as that we not only have we failed to have a literacy in the pre-existing law, we have failed to have a literacy in the pre-existing landscapes, and we have stuffed them up monumentally. And so our obligation in learning to belong together in country is to undo some of that damage, and to actually begin to pay the costs that have been imposed by what has given us privilege. So I actually disagree with your basic tenet that Aboriginal people didn't have records. Of course they had records.
I know that, but in terms of written language.
Doesn't matter whether it's, so in the Treaty of Waitangi, There were two versions of
It sort of imposes an obligation, well, more imposes the obligation on us to listen.
Yeah, but the Treaty of Waitangi was written down in two languages. It was written down in Te Reo Māori, and it was written in English. It was contested what the translation meant. And the oral version, transcribed from Te Reo Māori, was always the one that held the official weight, because the Brits tried to hoodwink them around the question of sovereignty and had a neologism, kavanatanga, put into the Māori version, which they said meant governorship, but in the English version was translated as sovereignty, which the Māori chiefs never conceded. So writing for non-literate people is often a trick, not a record. And we need to understand that. Yeah? We need to walk in other people's shoes a little bit more carefully.
Final question, it's a question from online.
Hello, online.
From Jenny Carter. Thank you so much, Richie. Our bureaucracies insist on feel-good initiatives like cultural awareness training, which does not absolve institutions from critical reflection on their structures and processes, or anti-racism. Any mention of anti-racism creates defensiveness. How do you think we can instead elevate the idea of anti-racism so it is embraced as a positive step towards decolonization, decolonized, inclusive, and effective institutions? Would this be a better step towards institutional capacity to engage?
For my sins, thanks, Jen. For my sins, I am trying to write a 10-minute version of this paper for the IAG conference in a couple of weeks. And I've decided that the way in is to, in fact, talk about what are the responsibilities of geographers in the institutions in which we operate. And for me, one of the first places that I found myself challenged to change practice was by becoming a member of my institutional ethics committee, because the institutional ethics committee had no idea what they were doing in relation to work with Indigenous communities. And my line has always been that the key authorities about research in Indigenous settings are the Indigenous authorities, and trying to teach universities that they need to let go of their power over research and give it to the Indigenous authorities was one of the things that I did at Macquarie University. And that led me to become a member of the Academic Senate, where I tried to tackle some of these issues, and become an elected member of the university governing body to try and tackle some of these issues in university governance. So my short answer, the shorter than 10-minute version of this paper for IAG, is that we have to act wherever we are and to find the way. So there isn't a one size, as I said in the paper, there's not a one size fits all answer. It has to be contextualised to where you're working.
Cool. Well, thank you, Richie, so much.
Thank you all.
I'd now like to invite Raffi Childs up to give a vote of thanks.
I'm going to put you in between us in case Raffi says something really dangerous.
Well, I think one of the surprising things. Oh, so the Zoomers.
Yeah, the Zoomers can.
Right. So here I am, Zoomers, to give the vote of thanks, as well as the people present here. One of the surprising things for me from Richie's talk tonight was this comparison between Taiwan and Australia, which I certainly would never have sort of thought of. And I'm sure many of us, were not expecting that as part of the talk tonight. So that has been very interesting and surprising, and certainly very thought-provoking. I guess for non-Indigenous folk like myself, it's very easy to forget or be unaware, really, of the history of colonisation and the meaning of colonisation. at which Richie has explained tonight very eloquently. And therefore it's easier to ignore the business as usual, which he has focused on. I think he has given us those 5 key reasons why, in his view, and many others probably, why it's very difficult for Indigenous folk to achieve their human rights and so on. Those 5 reasons in his presentation, very thought-provoking, those reasons. I guess, yes, the focus is business as usual must be rejected. And that has been Richie's final sort of very important point here this evening. So I think with that, and certainly there's a multitude of questions. Where do we go from here? What can we do, etc. And some of the questions tonight from the audience have, I think, initiated some of that. But I think now's the time to thank Richie very much for this evening's very intuitive and interesting talk about this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with that, everyone, we do bring our Thompson Oration for 2025 to a close. For all of those, both in person and online, please do check out the RGSQ website for more upcoming events. With that, though, everyone, have a fantastic evening. For those online, we will see you. And for those here in person, there are some light refreshments at the back of the room. With that, everyone, good night, and we'll see you again very soon.
Thank you.